In North Korea, young citizens were recently executed by firing squad for nothing more than enjoying South Korean soap operas and K-pop, things the authorities said were corrupting the minds of the youth. Over in Myanmar, citizens accused of dissent have been tortured with snakes and insects, while villages were burned to the ground by order of the military government. In Eritrea, East Africa, authorities regularly engage in torture and enforced disappearance as citizens are abducted from their villages and sold into modern-day slavery. These are the ends of the earth where freedom and rights are concerned. But in terms of totalitarian rule, brutality, and sheer madness, there's a place so strange and forbidding that it rarely gets mentioned. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain and take a look inside the most insane dictatorship on earth. Turkmenistan, a country that has been dubbed the North Korea of Central Asia, borders Uzbekistan to the north and Iran to the south. Covering around 190,000 square miles, a landmass similar to France or Spain, it sits between China, Russia, and Europe. Once overlooked on the global stage, its vast natural gas reserves have recently catapulted it into the center of geopolitical maneuvering. According to Freedom House and its latest Freedom Index, Turkmenistan ranks even lower than many of the world's most notorious dictatorships. That includes North Korea, a country where the vast majority of citizens are not aware of what the world looks like outside their own borders. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has labeled foreign artistic influence a vicious cancer, claiming it threatens the nation's culture. As a result, anyone caught enjoying bands like Blackpink or BTS risks being executed in front of a stadium of spectators, a brutal warning meant to eliminate outside influence entirely. Turkmenistan, tied with South Sudan as the least free nation on the planet, also has a long history of banning music, especially anything that could interfere with the thought processes of the Turkmen public. In 2024, the country banned foreign songs at weddings, telling citizens to play music in the Turkmen language, preferably songs sung by their musically talented former leader, a highly corrupt multi-billionaire we'll discuss throughout this video. Citizens were asked to praise him in their speeches, with reports saying non-compliance would not be tolerated. And as everyone understands, in Turkmenistan, walls have ears. You do what you're told. An anonymous source who'd recently watched some friends getting married told outside media everyone was terribly unhappy about how extensively the government is interfering in our private lives. A courageous statement considering the penalties for criticism of the powers that be. Still, despite a superlatively low score on the Freedom Index, Turkmen are said to be freer now than in the recent past. Things were a lot different during the era of Saparmurat Niyazov, Turkmenistan's first dictator-in-chief. Niyazov was a master of the ignoble lie, building a mythic persona through state-crafted propaganda we recognize as a cult of personality. To Westerners, this kind of rulership might seem like an absurdist political dark comedy, but for Turkmen, it was a harsh and brutal reality. Like Kim Jong-un in North Korea, Niyazov believed that music that didn't praise him or the great country he'd made in his image could corrupt the minds of the youth. In 2005, he decided the best way to deal with a burgeoning footloose population was to ban recorded music. Transgressors, he said, would be dealt with by the authorities. And indeed, plenty of Turkmen musicians have been arrested over the years for the crime of making pop music. After one such instance, reports from outside the country stated that police forcibly cut their hair and taunted them. Niyazov also banned recorded music on TV. Theme tunes or background music were forbidden. Cars were problematic because who doesn't like to listen to music on the radio? His solution was to decree that all radios be purged from vehicles. This was when he also banned beards for young men, because beards were apparently for terrorists. He banned long hair for males too, a style he believed was better suited to women. Opera and ballet were also banned. In his own words, he was, quote, protecting the true culture of Turkmenistan. Gold teeth were also out, because according to Niyazov, there was no need for them. He told the public they wouldn't need prosthetics if they just chewed on bones, as canines do, which he said would strengthen their teeth, just as it does for dogs. While there is a comedic element to these dog and teeth stories, the decrees were deadly serious. Niyazov set up a new Ministry of Justice to be a watchdog on amoral behavior, promising severe punishments to anyone who didn't adhere. In Turkmenistan, this can mean torture, arbitrary detention, or forced disappearance. We'll talk more about punishments later, but for now, let's stick with Niyazov's rampage on reason. He named a moon crater after himself. He put his name on a mountain peak. He said that a planet in the Taurus constellation should bear his name. The country's juiciest melons and a breed of horse were named after him. He also changed the names of days and months in reference to him, his family, or the greatness of the country he claimed to have designed and constructed from a prophetic vision. And who could argue? He had made himself president for life, telling his people he had ushered in a golden age in a country that, by some metrics, was closer to the Middle Ages. Let's go back in history now and see how all this madness started. For centuries, the area we now call Turkmenistan was home to nomadic tribes. Agriculture was difficult in a nation that was one very large expanse of stiflingly hot and very dry desert. Still, given its location on the Silk Road connecting China to present-day Iraq, it was an important place for budding conquerors. The ancient city of Marv was akin to an oasis, which over hundreds of years was controlled by Alexander the Great, the Parthian Empire, and the Sasanian Empire. The conquerors brought with them Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Judaism, among other religions. The Arab invasions of the 7th and 8th centuries brought Islam to Marv, the religion of 95% of Turkmen in the modern day. Genghis Khan arrived in the region in the 1200s, who in his conquest of Asia stopped in Marv, burned it to the ground, and murdered about 1 million people. It was after this devastation that the area we know today as Turkmenistan was ruled by various tribal peoples. Okay, admittedly, that's a lot of history in a very small nutshell, because the part we want to concentrate on is the arrival of the Russian Empire in the 1800s. The Tsarist Empire had its eyes on the entire Central Asian region, expressing a desire to subdue what it considered an uncivilized group of people. These groups, what we call the Khanates, were semi-nomadic people who, long after Britain abolished slavery in its vast empire, were some of the busiest slave traders in the entire world, if not the busiest in the 19th century. Millions of slaves were traded in this region throughout history, while hundreds of thousands of Persians, Kazakhs, and Russians were taken in raids in the 19th century and sold by the various Khanates in the slave markets of Central Asia. The men were usually put to work, and the women were often supplied to the harems of Muslim leaders. Both the Russian Empire and the British Empire wanted to hold sway in Central Asia, so ending slavery was a fitting pretext for invasion. By presenting themselves as civilizers, they could justify territorial expansion while exploiting the region's resources. This competition between the empires became known as the Great Game. In 1868, the Russians went to war with the Emirate of Bukhara and its capital, Bukhara, a center of slave trading in what is today part of Uzbekistan. The Russians won. They repeated this victory against the Khanate of Khiva in 1873, another major slave hub, which then became a Russian protectorate where slavery was soon abolished. In their conquest of Central Asia in 1881, the Russians fought the Teke tribe of Turkmens in what became known as the Battle of Göktepe, where about 7,200 Russians went up against 20 to 25,000 Turkmen at a fortress standing 28 miles from Turkmenistan's Ashgabat, the present capital city. Russian troops faced walls 18 feet high and 20 to 30 foot thick. They were vastly outnumbered, but they were an army with modern artillery fighting against nomadic traders whose conflict acumen was centered around raiding traveling caravans. The Russians did not have the supplies to maintain a siege and starve the Turkmen into submission, initially deciding on frontal assaults, which led to significant losses. With hundreds of Russian men killed and many more taken captive, the Russians made a hasty retreat through the desert to the Caspian Sea coast, only to return with new troops under a new commander, General Mikhail Skobelev. An experienced and wily man of war, on January 24, 1881, Skobelev had his men tunnel under the fortress and lay explosives. They blew up a large part of the walls, allowing the better-armed Russians to rush into the fort, where about 6,500 were killed and another 8,000 Turkmen soldiers and civilians were slaughtered in the aftermath. The Russians spared 5,000 or so women and freed the Persian slaves. Although the British, who were in a propaganda war with the Russians at the time, through the London Daily News reported no one was spared. Not even young children or the elderly. All were mercilessly cut down by Russian sabers. As all conflicts tend to be, the Great Game was a war of misinformation as well as military power. But there was some truth in what the newspaper said about barbarity. The surrendering men of the fort were slaughtered. The Russians then moved onward to Ashgabat, which was then just a small city, and on the way, the slaughter continued, including the murder of civilians. In Skobelev's own words, "The duration of the peace is in direct proportion to the slaughter you inflict upon the enemy. The harder you hit them, the longer they remain quiet." With this Machiavellian mindset to guide them, the Russians' Great Game ended with the domination of most of Central Asia. While there was no outright winner, the British protected its jewel in the crown, India, which included today's Myanmar, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. The two empires signed the Anglo-Russian Agreement in 1907, agreeing to accept each other's territory. So the Russians now had Turkmenistan, and the question now was, what were they going to do with a region of arid desert that had been completely untouched by European industry? This was a country that was 70% desert, the Karakum Desert, one of the driest places on Earth, which gets between 2.7 to 6 inches of rainfall per year, depending on the location, and whose recorded highest temperature is 122 degrees Fahrenheit, or 50 degrees Celsius. If we fast forward to the present day, it seems slavery or something close to slavery is alive and well in Turkmenistan. It's believed about 72,000 people in the country are forced to labor, something the government denies. However, human rights groups that have made the allegations are not allowed inside the country to inspect. These people are forcibly mobilized for work duties in what the human rights groups call, quote, widespread and systematic slavery. One of the things that the Russians discovered did grow in Turkmenistan was cotton. Today, about 198,000 tons of cotton are grown there each year, making it the fourth biggest export and a major contributor to the deep pockets of the elites. These elites own all the land, forcing farmers to lease and follow orders. From September to November each year is the harvest, a matter of the utmost importance regardless of a citizen's day job. The government decrees that when asked to pick the cotton, citizens must do their duty for a country that is presently the 9th largest cotton exporter in the world. This mobilizing of the masses includes public sector employees. Until very recently, even teachers and doctors had to commit to seasonal hard labor. If they didn't go, they would be fined or lose their jobs. Whether you were a man or a woman, whether you're sick or disabled, or even pregnant, if chosen, you must do your picking duty. Or at the very least, you must find someone to do it for you. While child labor is against the law, research shows that adults who were too busy working in their main jobs have sent their kids to the fields. Each of these workers is given a quota, which if they fail to meet it, they risk being punished. The farmers have no choice but to push the cotton pickers, since if they don't meet the expected supply numbers, they too will be punished. This practice of forced labor hurts the poorest the most, since citizens with more money often pay someone to take their place. As for women, Turkmenistan embraces very traditional values. Women quite often leave education early in order to procreate. If they work, they tend to earn less than men, a reason why so many cannot pay to avoid the yearly harvest. To keep the focus on women, girls in rural areas will often be guaranteed to a man when they're still young, with the future husband putting down a dowry of money, camels, or sheep. The women are expected to give birth as soon as they're in marriage. The younger, the better, which makes sense in a country with a present-day infant mortality rate of 35.9 deaths per 1,000 live births, in part due to a failing healthcare system. These numbers are a vast improvement on the past, too, when the leader closed down healthcare outside the capital city. Domestic violence is common, and often viewed as standard practice in rural areas where women's rights are all but non-existent. One woman said of the antiquated values where she lives, "In our village, if you put on a sleeveless dress or one with a slight split, you would be immediately branded as a prostitute." Prostitution is illegal, but it still happens. During recent crackdowns, corrupt police extorted women on the streets, accusing any woman found in bars or nightclubs of being prostitutes simply because they were in a place where traditionally only men should be. Turkmenistan might be a ruthless dictatorship, but in the cities, people still like to party. In recent raids on clubs in Ashgabat, women were detained by anti-prostitution squads just because they were there. Some were merely celebrating a birthday, others were out with their husbands. The hypocrisy is astounding, given local women are regularly trafficked out of the country for sex, usually to Turkey, with corrupt officials blessing rite of passage after collecting bribes. These women, as well as many males who are not blessed with wealth, might want to escape to another country, so the government puts strict limits on freedom of movement. Many people try to get to Russia, Turkey, or India, and even if after a 2-year wait they secure a passport, there's no guarantee they'll get out. Recent news articles tell us scores of people who'd legally paid for tickets were stopped at the airport by officials and turned back. Some were told they were on a blacklist and were banned from leaving, but weren't given a reason. One report said border guards create various problems for citizens at the airport, do not allow them to board the plane, and force them to return. Occasionally, there will be a complete ban on traveling. In 2023, news reports said Turkmen women who were married to foreigners were not being permitted to leave the country. Some reportedly did, mostly heading to Turkey, but only after they paid bribes to corrupt officials at Ashgabat International Airport. In 2024, the government feared too many people were leaving, so citizens with passports were ordered to hand them in to the authorities. This included students, who were made to sign a declaration that they would not try to study abroad. Later, we'll explore how Turkmenistan's state-controlled media instills fear in the people by spreading propaganda that warns going abroad is dangerous. Like most nations, Turkmenistan doesn't want to lose its labor force or experience a brain drain. But keeping your best minds is a challenge in a country where citizens have no rights. This is not to say that all Turkmen cannot see through government propaganda. Many can, but they just can't do anything about it. The government rules through fear, as well as inculcating widespread ignorance. In 2024, a 75-year-old journalist and activist named Sultan Achilova was scheduled to attend a conference on human rights. But before she could leave the country, 4 men in white lab coats turned up at her apartment and bundled her into the back of a van. The men told her she'd been deemed high risk for spreading infectious diseases, took her to a hospital, and detained her there. The fear of infectious disease, a fear more exploitable since the global pandemic, has been weaponized in Turkmenistan. This is known as arbitrary forced confinement. It's what often happens to critics and activist bloggers who write about conditions in Turkmenistan. Some are sent to solitary confinement. Some are never seen again. According to the Prove They Are Alive campaign, since 2002, 162 people have disappeared after being arrested on vague charges. The campaigners say each of these missing people were considered political threats to absolute power. Let's now go back in history again, before we continue with the dystopian present. The Russian Empire had successfully expanded into Central Asia, but everything changed with the Russian Revolution. Turkmenistan became an anti-Bolshevik stronghold, resisting Soviet control until the Bolsheviks emerged victorious. In the 1920s, as the Soviet Union took shape, Turkmenistan's modern borders were officially drawn, integrating it into the USSR's network of republics. The plan was to industrialize the country and introduce collective farming. For decades, Russia had been beset by famines. Control of Central Asian agriculture was an attempt to prevent future mass starvation. Russian officials were sent to oversee the state-controlled collectives. Then, in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev became the first secretary of the Communist Party. He shook up the communist world with his criticism of the former leader, the tyrannical Joseph Stalin. Khrushchev immediately embarked on a campaign of reforms, introducing the Virgin Lands Campaign in 1954, designed to extract agricultural products from the Central Asian Soviets. The Russians built a canal in Turkmenistan that year that tripled the amount of arable land. At the same time, Russians were encouraged to move to Turkmenistan. They weren't there just to lead resource extraction, but as teachers in schools who would enlighten nomadic Turkmen families as to the glory of modern Russia. While cotton production soared after the canal's construction, Turkmenistan remained incredibly poor. Many of the wealthiest people were now Russian expatriates, who made up about 15% of a population that increased from 1.2 million to 1.5 million over a 20-year period. Cotton production increased from 150,000 tons per year to about 400,000 tons per year. This put Turkmenistan on the map of international trade. But much of the profits from the industry went back to Russia. The people felt like their land was being exploited, not for them, but for outsiders who knew little about their culture. Their belief was further confirmed in the 1960s, after the Russians discovered major gas fields in the Karakum Desert. In 1966, the Dowletabad gas field, close to the Iranian border, quickly became one of the largest gas fields in the world. During this era, the average life expectancy was about 55 years, one of the lowest in the Northern Hemisphere. Infant mortality rates were some of the worst in the world too, at 130.3 deaths per 1,000 live births. Literacy rates were also relatively very bad. In terms of data from other Soviet republics, Turkmenistan was being left behind in the Great Soviet Project. Moscow shipped off Russian officials and engineers to build pipelines, gas plants, and new transport networks, transforming a nation that had once been one of the most remote places on the planet. The oil continued to be pulled out of the ground in the direction of Russia and other Soviet republics, again leaving the Turkmen without much to show from what had become an oil boom. And now, parts of it were heavily polluted, while former tribal people, forced to work in the cotton farms and the gas plants, felt like their culture was being eradicated. The ecosystems they'd relied on for centuries were interrupted. No more evident than in the 1971 gas leak in Darvasa, right in the middle of the desert. To prevent deadly poisoning, Moscow ordered that the leak be ignited, creating a seemingly eternal flame that is now known as the Darvasa gas crater, a frightening conflagration that looks like it comes from the pits of hell. The Turkmen population was by then already familiar with natural disasters. In 1948, an earthquake near the capital wiped out up to 100,000 people, around 10% of the country's population. The Soviets did their best to keep the news under wraps, neither informing the rest of the world nor the Turkmen who lived in the rest of the country. This would, in time, generate more ill will towards the Soviet masters. One man who would later exploit this antipathy and distrust was the future Turkmen president, Saparmurat Niyazov. He lost his mother and two brothers in the earthquake, and his father had been killed fighting for the Soviets in World War II. With many of his other relatives dying in the earthquake, he was left an orphan. He would one day exploit this tragedy of youth to create a mythological stature for himself. The country was always ripe for a future dictator. During the days of natural resource exploitation, the Soviets closed down mosques, suppressing religion and religious leaders. Under the communist materialist belief, people's faith and energy should be directed toward the Union. Under Russification imperatives, the Soviets attempted to erase nomadic traditions that went back hundreds of years. They took men away from their cherished horses and sent them to work on collective farms. So, when the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991, Turkmenistan was ready for a leader who would promise to reinvigorate national pride. Before the collapse, Niyazov had been the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Turkmen SSR. He took over from Muhammadnazar Gapurov, who'd led from the late 1960s but lost his job under a cloud of nepotism and corruption. While some aspects of the country did modernize during the oil and cotton boom days, corruption was a thread that ran ran throughout the fabric of existence in Turkmenistan. Niyazov would take that thread and make it into a blanket that smothered every inch of the country. He embarked on a mission to enrich himself and his powerful elite friends. Prior to that, he'd given his full support to the Communist Party. He'd supported the overthrow of the reformer, Mikhail Gorbachev. It was the communists who had put him in power, and he feared any change that would threaten that power. He knew very well there was resentment in his country coming from nationalists and Islamist hardliners. Political liberalization could be the end of him if his people were given rights of speech and expression. Moreover, Turkmenistan's entire economy was deeply tied to Russian trade agreements, infrastructure, resource management, and governance. With Moscow controlling everything from education to economic planning, Niyazov feared that breaking away from the Soviet Union would lead to total economic collapse. Nevertheless, the coup he supported failed, and Turkmenistan suddenly found itself floating in an independent reality, its anchor unhooked from its Soviet keeper. Fearing revolt and anxious over what political freedom might do to the status quo, Niyazov quickly made himself the leader of the Turkmens. In 1992, he rigged an election where he was the sole candidate, securing 99.5% of the vote. In 1994, he held a referendum to extend his term of office until 2002, claiming the people wanted him as their leader and that they feared instability would arise without him. 99.9% of voters agreed with him, an impossibility that would become a future of Turkmen life for many years to follow. Then, in 1999, he declared himself president for life. As he saw it, his best option was to rule with an iron fist, all the while promising freedom and prosperity as he propagandized the masses to ensure they didn't see the contradiction. The populace heard that their country, their once great and unique culture, would be revived. He said he'd usher in sweeping economic reforms. He said he'd write a constitution and create a political environment of checks and balances. If the people trusted him, he promised them a golden age, more comfort than they could imagine now that natural resource revenues were directed home rather than heading to Russia and the other Soviet republics. In reality, he was selling off those resources to Russia at bargain basement prices, although Russia still controlled the infrastructure, leaving Turkmenistan few options to become truly independent. As is the way of the totalitarian, Niyazov's influence gradually infiltrated every aspect of day-to-day life. He introduced a new Latin-based Turkmen alphabet in place of Russian Cyrillic. He invented a new history, partly based on facts and partly based on fantasy. He told his people he'd been blessed with a vision, a prophecy delivered to him that showed him the way to a golden path of life for the Turkmen people. This history and his visions were laid out in the book Ruhnama, a kind of quasi-holy text that was required reading for the entire population. This was how he developed his cult of personality, telling his people how he'd been orphaned from tragedy and how fate had chosen him to lead them after Soviet imperialism. The book tells its readers, and the entire nation, that he who reads the Ruhnama 3 times will find spiritual wealth, will become more intelligent, will recognize the divine existence, and will go straight to paradise. In churches and the mosques, the book lay at the side of the Bible and the Quran. Niyazov didn't claim to be God, but he was God's messenger. If you studied in school, you studied the Ruhnama. If you worked in government, the Ruhnama was always at your side. You couldn't get a job for the state without being fluent in this book, making it hard for minorities who couldn't read the Turkmen language to find employment. You couldn't even pass a driving test without knowing the Ruhnama inside and out. In short, understanding life was understanding the Ruhnama. As George Orwell had once written, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. This was the blueprint for Niyazov's leadership in a country that would carry on the national absurdity under its future leaders. In the early 2000s, the book was still the core of school curriculums, often replacing academic subjects that could potentially develop what was still a very backward nation. Young people spent hours per week in high school and university reading passages such as this: "The beard grows from the brain. The longer the beard, the less brain there is. the less brain, the less wisdom the person has. The book was said to be equal to the Quran and the Bible, and so at the center of the entire universe. Parents took their children to Ashgabat Park, where they could gaze at a 20-foot neon ruhnama. In 2005, citizens were told that their national book would conquer space, with a copy of it being launched into orbit on a Russian Dnepr booster rocket. The national media, which as you'll see later only serves as propaganda, said the book that conquered the hearts of millions on Earth is now conquering space. Let's go back to the 1990s and take a closer look at the early days of Niyazov's reign. Niyazov wanted his people to feel proud of their independence, but Russia still had control over Turkmenistan's natural resources, using its infrastructure to buy gas very cheaply. Turkmenistan remained very poor outside of a few elites. Despite a struggling economy, Niyazov did everything in his power to placate his people, giving them free water, gas, and electricity, promising it would remain that way for 10 years. He wanted to be adulated, but his country couldn't afford his ostentatious kindness. He promised human rights, yet any criticism was met with detention without trial or forced disappearance. He banned prostitution, yet no sooner than he took over power, young girls were collected from provinces and sent to the city to entertain high-ranking officials. Reports say the girls were chosen for their beauty and their manners. They were going to Ashgabat to continue their education and one day be rewarded with a prestigious job. The parents didn't have a choice but to let their girls go. The women assigned to what was essentially kidnapping these girls first checked that the girls had pure blood. Aged 17 to 20, the girls also had to have healthy skin. They needed good teeth, and they had to be slim and beautiful. The women measured the girls to ensure they met the criteria. Reports state that the ones who weren't quite right, and perhaps not so pretty, didn't go to waste, but were sent to officials who held lower ranks. An article on the matter explained, if the girl does not qualify, then she is trained for other purposes. For instance, servicing the country's senior officials at receptions and other events. The girls are taught etiquette and polite manners, and are trained to properly set tableware and take away dishes. In the mid-90s, with Russia still getting away with resource exploitation, new oil pipelines were opened to Iran. A railway to Iran was also built, making it possible to ship cotton and other goods. Then, in 1998, Turkmen leaders met with President Bill Clinton and signed an agreement to expand economic and commercial relations with the US. The country was promised integration into the global economy, provided it agreed to privatization initiatives and followed the holy orders of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. In other words, the US was bringing Turkmenistan into its so-called sphere of influence because there were natural gas reserves to be had. Naturally, the US did not want all of this oil in Turkmenistan going to Iran and Russia. Clinton's office put out a press release telling the American people democratization, economic reform, and observance of human rights are essential to Turkmenistan's future. Free elections, human rights, the rule of law, and political pluralism, all with active support from the world's most powerful country. It sounded great on paper, but it was never going to happen. What the US really wanted, outside of promises to democracy, was the Trans-Caspian gas pipeline. It would connect gas reserves to Europe and away from Iran, Russia, and the US's future threat to its superpower status, China. However, close relations with the US came with its own set of risks, especially to the Turkmen elites who didn't want to lose their grip on power. It also seems, given the CIA's reputation, Niyazov was a believer in what the US diplomat and realist political scientist Henry Kissinger once said, "It may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal." After the meeting with Clinton, Russia signed an agreement to pay higher prices for oil, and Turkmenistan became a fast-growing economy. So, in what is sometimes called the new Great Game, Russia got what it wanted at a cost. Meanwhile, the US had a war on terror to fight, so interest in Turkmenistan took a back seat. In 2003, Russia and Turkmenistan signed another oil contract, this time for 25 years, on the condition that the Turkmen didn't sell gas to the West. In 2025, that contract is almost over. Turkmenistan is now flashing on the map of geopolitics. 80% of its gas now goes to China, and while Russia doesn't play as big a part, China doesn't want Turkmenistan's gas going to Europe. With the new oil deals, billions of dollars flooded into Turkmenistan in the late 90s and early 2000s, exporting about 13.2 to 15.4 trillion imperial gallons of natural gas per year. It was now one of Central Asia's biggest energy exporters. Did this mean the streets were paved with gold? Did it mean new state-of-the-art infrastructure, improved life expectancy, a cultural renaissance based on free expression? The answer is no. What it did mean was Swiss bank accounts and offshore companies filling up with stacks of foreign money. As most of the country suffered, Niyazov built beautiful statues of himself. He gave the people watches with dials with his face printed on them. He showed Turkmen what a great country they lived in when he erected his $12 million tripod, the so-called Neutrality Monument, a 246-foot edifice with elevators in its legs. The monument was to show that Turkmenistan was neutral in global politics. Was it neutral? Is it still neutral? Well, while it claims to be, it certainly looks closer to what Western propagandists call the new axis of evil: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Back to Niyazov. He put his face on banknotes. He put it on the flag. His name was in the national anthem. He erected a 39-foot golden statue of himself on top of the Neutrality Monument that rotated so it could always face the sun. When broadcasts played on TV, his logo was always on the screen. Meanwhile, he professed humility, once saying, "I'm personally against seeing my pictures and statues in the streets, but it's what the people want." In his effort to build a great city that stood as a reflection of his godliness, he imported so much white marble from Italy that Ashgabat soon had more marble than any other city in the world. But this was the age of the internet, where his people could possibly read online about how terribly corrupt he was and how so insanely absurd their country could be. So, as you'd expect from a tyrant, he closed down internet cafes, the main place people could go online since few people had PCs. In 2005, only 0.7% of Turkmens had access to the internet, and many of those would have benefited from the corrupt system. Niyazov also closed the country's library. Just as China's dictator Chairman Mao had once said, Niyazov believed reading too many books is dangerous. He said his people only needed 3 books: the Bible, the Quran, and of course, Ruhnama. And as media propaganda told citizens how good their lives were, Niyazov shut down all hospitals outside the capital, saying if people were ill or injured, well, the best healthcare awaited them in the most wonderful city in the world. Doctors were fired en masse, and the ones that were left had to swear not the Hippocratic Oath, but an allegiance to their great leader. In total, 15,000 medical staff got the boot. They went from treating sick people to being handed guns as conscripted soldiers. In 2017, a doctor called Kursanaye Ismatulayeva was fired because she wouldn't take bribes and give patients totally unnecessary treatments. She was detained immediately after her case was mentioned at a European Parliament meeting called Oppression Practices in Central Asia: Voices of Human Rights Defenders. It seems she was already under surveillance. News reports said men turned up at her house and took her away. Her family or friends were not told where they'd taken her. Her computers and phone were also confiscated. According to outside media, her enforced disappearance resulted in 9 years in prison on what were completely bogus charges. Reports state she grew very sick in prison and was denied a doctor despite losing a lot of her body weight. As corruption flourished and the nation was mismanaged, Niyazov took away pensions from about a third of the population, resulting in the deaths of many elderly people. Despite this, Niyazov maintained that dangerous foreign outsiders lied about his country. There were occasionally activists inside the nation who were collected from their homes and tortured with psychotropic drugs. Journalists and also religious minorities were taken to drug rehabilitation centers and treated with an injection. One victim said he became paralyzed after they dosed him with drugs. In what was surely another demonstration of Niyazov's power, he even decreed that all dogs be banned from the capital, saying they carried an odor not suitable for his great white marble wonder. When he gave up smoking after a health scare, he told his people that smoking was now banned in all public places. That was around the time he banned the opera and ballet, erecting a giant ice palace in their wake. An ice palace in the middle of a country of scorching temperatures and desert. He also built a zoo and imported penguins. The reason for the palace, he said, was, quote, "Every child in Turkmenistan should learn how to ice skate." It was finished in 2006. However, the cost of the ambitious project was never revealed, but was rumored to be in the region of $29 million. It's not that the people of his country didn't deserve figure skating and hockey, but to have such a place in the world's oven while people were losing their pensions and went hungry seemed like an extravagance. Exciting news about palaces was delivered to Turkmen on TV channels where the presenters had been banned from wearing makeup. Real Turkmen, said Niyazov, should be the color of wheat. In his decree about this, he wrote, "Female presenters wear too much whitening powder. Sometimes male presenters do the same. This cannot be allowed." The people were put to work, and cheap labor was imported into the capital to build 5-star hotels. Entire neighborhoods were demolished to make room for these luxuries. Meanwhile, many of those laborers lived on the outskirts in shipping containers. Some were addicted to the opium and heroin that had constantly flowed through Turkmenistan since Niyazov took control, making officials wealthy, as drugs often do in developing nations. With this much power, there was, of course, opposition. In the early 2000s, flyers circulated in the capital, calling for Niyazov to be overthrown. Then, on November 25, 2002, his motorcade was fired upon in broad daylight as it traveled through downtown Ashgabat. The bullets from the automatic weapons bounced off the bulletproof windows in his Mercedes-Benz without injuring anyone. As assassination attempts go, it was pathetic or conveniently low effort. Niyazov went after his enemies immediately. It was said that he had the names of the conspirators before he got back to safety at the presidential palace. The blame was laid at the feet of Turkmen opposition in exile and foreign mercenaries, who he said were working with disloyal politicians in his government. It's now thought the reason he had the names so quickly is that the event was a false flag, a reason for him to remove the men he didn't deem loyal. False flag or not, he used the attack as an excuse to purge scores of men from his government. He demanded heightened surveillance in his country, weakening the little privacy already afforded to his people. CCTV cameras were set up in all public places by decree. He cracked down on freedom of movement and revoked dual citizenship for ethnic Russians. As a British researcher wrote, the unsuccessful coup attempt inadvertently abetted Niyazov's propensity to lead his country into an ever greater state of isolation. He had more power than ever after the assassination attempt. He had secured oil deals with Iran and now also China, releasing his country from what had been dependency on Russia. And now he felt justified in making his nation more oppressive than it had ever been. Just as Niyazov was enjoying this unparalleled control, he fell to his knees on December 21, 2006. Despite him having access to the best healthcare the world had to offer, his life of rich food and heavy alcohol consumption had caught up with him. This time, the assassin was cardiac arrest. He was just 66 years old, which statistically was about right, given the average life expectancy in his nation was somewhere between 64 and 66 at the time of his death. It was only 68 in 2021, although women on average in the 21st century could expect to live 5 to 7 years longer, a result of men doing most of the hazardous and stressful work, and their proclivity to smoke and drink, despite laws around limiting consumption of those drugs. After Niyazov's unexpected death, his country braced itself, just as Russia had done after the death of Stalin. The BBC wrote, Turkmenistan, which has large gas reserves, now faces an uncertain future, with rival groups and outside powers scrambling for influence. For the educated citizenry, there was some hope that their absurdist nation would become more open and democratic. Would this land of bizarreness lighten up and reverse Niyazov's many strange decrees? State news told the people to be calm and brave as they dealt with the, quote, severe ordeal which has befallen our nation. A week of mourning was to be observed, and New Year's celebrations were cancelled. The constitution demanded that the next in line would be Ovesgeldi Atayev, chairman of the Assembly of Turkmenistan. By law, it was decreed he'd become acting president during the chaos of a power vacuum. But it seems the elites deemed him not worthy. They had him arrested, claiming human rights abuse charges and abuse of power. It was a case of choosing the new elite and getting rid of the unwanted. The man who filled Niyazov's golden boots was Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedow, who at the time was one of the deputy prime ministers and the minister of health. Once he was acting president, he promised his people a free and fair election. What they got was a masquerade of the democratic process, in which he came away with 89% of the vote. The result caused international organizations to call the election a blatant sham. Now, as leader, just as Niyazov had done, Berdimuhamedow promised his people reforms. He said he'd bring back the pensions that had been taken away. He promised he'd put an end to the nepotism that had plagued his country. He'd weed out the corruption of the elites that had become wealthy from oil while leaving the rest of the nation to fight over scraps of meat. And he said he'd educate the people, and this would begin with a lesson in the cult of personality his predecessor had fine-tuned. Those days were over, he claimed. He'd free up the internet and people could see for themselves what the rest of the world said about Turkmenistan. He made good on some of those promises, including getting his people back on the internet. Today, around 2.5 million from a population of 7.3 million are online, whether via a home connection or mobile. As we'll explore later, these people might be online, but facing them is a firewall they would be reckless to try and bypass. This leaves them with not much internet diversity. Berdimuhamedow did give the people their pensions, but the freedom he promised, the end to nepotism, never materialized. He still intended to rob his country and rule by brute force. Berdimuhamedow wasn't just a man of modern-sounding reforms, he was cool as ice, glistening in the oasis of the Turkmenistan desert. In terms of optics, he was a dictator you could trust. Let's jump forward to 2021, as his term was coming to an end. That year, much of the population of Turkmenistan would have been watching their tightly controlled state TV channels when two young men appeared at a beach resort on the Caspian Sea about to sing a rap song. Turkmenistan was now hip-hop adjacent. One of the young men was the grandson of Mr. Berdimuhamedow. He joined them with fist bumps as they broke into song. A song very different in tone from the formal numbers Niyazov had written about his own vast greatness. The rap, sung in English, contained the line, "Life is so wonderful in my motherland, my splendid and dazzling Turkmenistan." Because everyone knows, when life is wonderful, you need to be constantly told it is. Berdimuhamedow was always on TV, doing something popular, smart, or brave. As everyone in Turkmenistan knows, he's not just good at rap, but also soccer, horse racing, motor racing, DJing, book writing, and shooting guns. You name it, he can do it, including being a very able guitarist. Over the years, he's often appeared on TV, playing and singing for his loyal people. In one such song, titled Ray of Happiness, he plays in front of clapping construction workers at a new gas plant. In the comments section of the YouTube video, people writing in Russian either compliment Berdimuhamedow's guitar playing skills or offer a short critique of authoritarianism. Someone asks why, when the workers played, their guitars were out of tune but Berdimuhamedow's wasn't. To which one person answered, "In Turkmenistan, it is forbidden to play better than the president." So, what Turkmen had with Berdimuhamedow was another cult of personality. It just wasn't quite as absurd as what came before. He was a tyrant, but to many of his people, he was the embodiment of cool, good at anything he put his hands to. He actually once fell off his horse in a race that was supposed to be for public consumption, but the accident showed imperfection, so the video was suppressed. Instead, the people saw him hanging out of fast-moving trucks, and one time watched him riding a bicycle with one hand and shooting a gun with the other. Compared to his predecessor, he was depicted as a lighthearted, much more forgiving ruler. He once gave Russian President Vladimir Putin a puppy, an act of sweetness that blurred reality. His PR team hired Jennifer Lopez to play at his 56th birthday, something she later said she regretted. It was reported she received $1 million for singing Happy Birthday, much to the outrage of many Westerners. But outside all his showmanship and propaganda, he was another multi-billionaire, making a handful of elites in his country incredibly wealthy, all while the rest of the population suffered in silence. Despite his benign appearance, the rules remained the same about torture and enforced disappearance. Criticism was still absolutely verboten. Outside the country, U.S. diplomatic cables exposed by WikiLeaks called Berdimuhamedow a vain liar accused of corruption on a vast scale. He was a control freak and enriched his family and friends through a culture of bribery, nepotism, and embezzlement. While Niyazov was a madman where decrees were concerned, Berdimuhamedow was said to be more corrupt, going as far as once accepting a $60 million yacht from a Russian gas company to merely speed up the conclusion of a deal. Berdimuhamedow enriched himself even more after he orchestrated the oil deals with China, although in some ways the country did prosper, hence small improvements in life expectancy. He reopened many of the medical clinics Niyazov had closed. He also improved the standard of higher education, significantly reducing the amount of studying of the great Ruhmana, taking it out of schools, churches, and mosques. He took down statues, did away with constant stultifying ceremonies, and he reopened libraries and even encouraged reading. However, most of the few bookstores in the country today are state-run, and in the private ones, the selection is meager. By 2015, 80 to 90% of the oil was headed to China. Berdimuhamedow used much of this money to make the White City even more wondrous than it already was. He built stadiums, sports complexes, and a tourist village said to look like a mini Las Vegas. This place is called Avaza, where you can get year-round mud therapy at a wellness sanatorium. He sang songs about it, among others he titled Prosperity and Protector. 23 hotels in this Central Asian Vegas cost about $5 billion. The pristine white capital of Ashgabat is indeed spotless, home to grand buildings, museums, and beautiful parks where you don't find a scrap of waste paper. But as Berdimuhamedow made this magnificent city, he rewrote the constitution and cracked down on dissent with zero tolerance. The authorities still use torture to attain confessions. There are still detentions without trials and forced disappearances of government critics. Amnesty International documented recent torture, which included pushing needles under fingernails, applying electric shocks, asphyxiation with a plastic bag, and the use of psychotropic drugs. While the activists are imprisoned, there are threats to their families. All the while, independent journalism in the country is met with more extreme intolerance. As this goes on, an estimated $28 billion sits in offshore bank accounts, profits from the new gas deals and cotton harvests. In what the people have been told is an area of happiness under Berdimuhamedow and later his son, there have been food rationing and reports of mass hunger. The government denies there's extreme poverty, making it impossible for international aid to flow. After gas prices plummeted in 2015 and food subsidies vanished, aid organizations were persona non grata and activists were punished if they talked about what was really going on. Meanwhile, Turkmenistan media regularly showed images of subsidized shops whose shelves were bursting with goods. If TV cameras visited cities where food lines were long, police broke up the lines and sent the people home. These government-subsidized stores were cheaper than the local market, but queuing up for hours could lead to someone going home empty-handed and still hungry. As the majority of people suffered, the government ushered in new rules, such as in 2018 when dark-colored cars were banned in Ashgabat. Black cars were towed from the streets, taken from the owners who were told either to respray it or lose them. A resident who earned $285 a month was told the repaint would cost almost $2,000 at a state-owned garage. If he waited a week more, it increased to $3,100. It was that or lose his vehicle. The people weren't even given a reason. Black cars were already banned for importation, which was likely in line with the city's white color scheme. Image is everything. In this swelteringly hot city, AC units were also banned from blocks of apartments, with the government saying they looked ugly. No one could argue about the beauty aspect. As people went hungry, a 606-foot-high monument to the Constitution was erected in 2011 that cost $60 million. A fairly recent new extravagance was a 19-foot statue of a golden dog, or to be exact, an alabai, Turkmenistan's national breed. The cost is unknown, but Turkmen politicians never scrimp on money. Berdimuhamedow's so-called Palace of Happiness, the place to be if citizens are getting married, cost $140 million. But the biggest extravagance of them all is the new Smart City, estimated to cost $3.3 billion. By the time it's fully finished, it will have risen to $4.8 billion. At least a smart city can lead to education and development of the economy. Still, you might wonder if a country that can't feed many of its citizens really needs a city that has tactile sidewalk tiles and a transportation infrastructure that makes New York or London look grubby. So, after all this, what's in store for this poor, oil-rich nation in the future? After Berdimuhamedow won 2 elections in 2012 and 2017 with about 97% of the vote, it was evident that the supposedly democratic nature of these elections was another farce. That doesn't mean he didn't have any support. In a non-official poll, 1 in 5 Turkmens said they'd check the box with Berdimuhamedow's name in it. Still, 20% isn't quite 97%. One man explained, "During Niyazov's rule, I lost 2 sons. Heroin took them both away from me when they were still young. I will forever be grateful to the president for eliminating drugs." Others liked Berdimuhamedow's reforms. One woman said she hadn't even heard of the other candidates. An official who wouldn't be named had a different reason. He said he and his colleagues at a prosecutor's office were informed by their bosses that if they didn't vote for Berdimuhamedow, they'd, quote, be considered a traitor. Let's now have a closer look at media communications in modern Turkmenistan. The Constitution says that the press should be free, but in practice, all news is propaganda, whether privately owned or state media. TV consists of 5 channels, all strictly regulated. Turkmen do have satellite and cable, so people can watch certain shows from Russia, Turkey, and Uzbekistan, but they definitely won't have the option to see foreign journalistic deep dives on the country they call home. As for Western content through the internet, Turkmenistan blocks about 1/3 of all the world's IPs. There's no Netflix, no BBC News, no YouTube, no Rumble, or any other platforms where you could potentially watch a video about politics or poverty in Turkmenistan. Social media is also blocked, so that means no Facebook, X, Instagram or TikTok, etc. As for WhatsApp, well, that's complicated. We'll talk about this in a minute. Turkmenistan online news websites contain news about important foreign dignitaries visiting wonderful Turkmenistan, exciting business partnerships with other nations, plus a lot of other stories concerning industrial production booms. There isn't much bad news, so quite the opposite of the media in the rest of the world. Culture-based stories claimed Turkmen fairy tales were recently translated into some of the languages of the world, including English. Turkmen flowers, Turkmen food, Turkmen poems are also reaching a global audience. As for sports, the media covers the many accomplishments of its athletes, but there's very little information about sport outside of Turkmenistan. It's the same with travel, with many stories about the beauty of Turkmenistan, a fact seemingly drilled into the people as a matter of national pride. The rare crime stories that are reported consist of propaganda, a warning to all citizens thinking about leaving their great country. As for USA News, there was a story about 40 Turkmen who were deported from America and were sent back to Turkmenistan. These people, some of them reportedly the children of high-ranking officials, would be, quote, summoned for questioning. Overall, the news in Turkmenistan promotes a positive outlook, as long as citizens stay in the country and work hard for the benefit of everyone else. Turkmen media did carry a story about corrupt officials being called out for dereliction of duty, a popular article in totalitarian countries when someone needs to be replaced. In fact, outside news media in 2024 said officials increasingly exploit their positions to extort money. Bribery, said the article, is a way of life. Let's finish this media section with a lady named Sarigol Matyeva, who turned 117 in 2025. The article explained that she liked to tell her 97 great-grandchildren the answer to a happy life was don't sleep too much, don't be sad, and always have a goal. In other words, work hard and don't complain. As we mentioned earlier, social media is blocked in Turkmenistan if you don't have a VPN to get around the government's firewall. A risk, considering installing one is illegal, and there have been many arrests. In some cases, the arrestees were fined or given a 15-day jail sentence. Reports say businesses who helped people get VPNs risked being closed down. Students who need the internet the most to educate themselves were having to sign declarations, swearing not to access prohibited websites and to go online only for educational purposes. Reports in 2021 said some citizens had waited years to get their Wi-Fi connection, and once they did, the officials made them swear on the Quran to never circumvent the firewall. However, it seems some Turkmen do get online from time to time and visit banned websites. Those who do get online are often found defending their nation, stating they do not live in a place comparable to North Korea. Some said they watch news about the world, go to bars, and drink alcohol, and even smoke in public. Their point was they're just like you, and not as oppressed as people might think they are. Still, it's a fact that few people in the country would have access to this video, and fewer still would air a criticism of their country or leaders in a public forum. That said, there have been recent signs that some light might penetrate the black hole that is Turkmenistan's communications complex. A recent news article said WhatsApp might be unblocked in the country, and Turkmen people would be able to use it, quote, like people in the rest of the world. Turkmen people do at least have phones, with 6.25 million mobile cellular subscriptions in 2021, equating to a mobile penetration rate of 99 subscriptions per 100 inhabitants. There were 2.59 million internet users at the beginning of 2024, with an internet penetration of 39.5%. Still, that means 60.5% don't have an internet connection, with many of those people living in rural areas. As for the state of politics in the present day, Berdimuhamedow could have stayed in office until 2024, but after a snap election in 2022, a new man came to power. This is where the word dynasty comes into the equation, because Turkmenistan's new leader was none other than one of his sons, Serdar Berdimuhamedow. In what was another sham election, he won easily with 72.9% of the vote. He now rules with an iron fist and his father at his side. The state media calls him the son of the nation, a sure sign he'll develop his own cult of personality, but more akin to his father than Niyazov's divine ruler scheme. In 2025, it is hard to get away with saying you're divine, and harder still to commit mass atrocities. Totalitarianism has evolved to meet with modernity, and it involves heavy doses of PR. Indeed, Serdar is young, handsome, and speaks English, which might make him more appealing to a modern audience. In 2024, Turkmenistan reported a 6.3% increase in GDP. Although it's not certain if this is exact, still, GDP projections are positive, with the new young leader saying he will invest $11 billion towards infrastructure and modernization. The recent Turkmenistan-Afghanistan-Pakistan-India, or TAPI pipeline, is set to add some more boom to what the politicians say will be a more diverse economy in the near future. A new pipeline to Turkey is also on the way, further enhancing Turkmenistan as a major player as European nations seek to reduce their reliance on Russia. The country is now the world's fourth largest reserve of natural gas, with 50% of its GDP coming from gas exports. 2023 saw an all-time high GDP of $60.6 billion a year, but Turkmenistan is still quite poor. With such a small population, a GDP per capita at over $8,000 is better than Thailand, Colombia, and South Africa, and much better than Guatemala, Iran, and Vietnam. Of course, GDP per capita doesn't mean much when you have a criminally extreme wealth disparity in your country. As you've learned, so much of that oil money is sucked out by the elites. These people build beautiful streets and monuments for fame and glory while stuffing their people's potential future well-being into offshore bank accounts. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. Really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on MapPack.